The Persian army lands at Marathon, and in doing so makes a choice that is tactically sound and, in the end, though by accident, disastrous. Marathon is a broad coastal plain on the eastern edge of Attica. It's relatively flat and well suited to cavalry operations. Seen by the Persians, it is ideal terrain. Persian warfare, as we've seen, is built around mobility. Archers, light infantry, cavalry operating in space, not confined passes. Herodotus tells us that Hippias, the exiled tyrant of Athens, advises this landing site. That detail matters. Hippias knows Attica, he knows where the Persian tactics will work best, and he believes, or chooses to believe, that Marathon is also friendly territory, with sympathizers who remember his rule and may rise in his favour. Whether Hippias is deluded or merely hopeful, Herodotus does not say. What matters is that Persian strategy here is not blind. It is informed by local knowledge and by the assumption that Athens, like other Greek cities, is politically divided and therefore vulnerable. For Athens, the effect is immediate and, of course, terrifying. The Persians have not landed at some distant border. They have landed inside Attica, within marching distance of the city itself. There is no buffer, there is no natural barrier, there is no time. Athens is suddenly faced with extinction, not metaphorical extinction, but the real possibility of destruction, followed by deportation or the restoration of tyranny under Persian auspices. Herodotus does not dramatize this with speeches. He doesn't need to. The situation speaks for itself. The Athenians act at once. They send their runner Pheidippides to Sparta, begging for help. Herodotus tells us that he reaches Sparta in 2 days, an astonishing achievement if you look at the miserable apology that the Greeks managed for their roads before the Romans turned up. Herodotus gives us that bare fact, then adds a detail that reveals his habits as an historian. On the journey, Pheidippides encounters the god Pan, who asks why the Athenians do not honour him. Later, Pan will receive a shrine beneath the Acropolis. This is not reportage in the modern sense. It is Herodotus reminding us that for the Greeks, physical endurance and divine encounter and political crisis coexist in the same narrative space. What matters for the Athenians, however, is the Spartan response. The Spartans listen. They refuse to act. They explain. They are observing the Carneia, a major religious festival. Until the moon is full, they cannot march. Herodotus reports their answer plainly. They would help, but they could not break the law. You can see this as religious obligation. Spartan society is built on obedience to custom and law, and religious law is not subordinate to political emergency. Or you might take a darker view of it. The Spartans do not like the Persians, but the Persians are far away, and although presently close, they may soon be far away again. They certainly don't like the Athenians, and the Athenians are rather close. But I think I can leave you to join the dots in those reflections. As far as Athens is concerned, the Spartan motivations don't matter. The Spartans will not come, or if they do come, it won't be in time. So at this point, Athens stands completely alone, or almost completely alone. No Spartan army is on the march, or will be on the march when it matters. No reinforcements are visible. The Persian force is already deployed in Attica, or soon will be. Delay only improves Persian chances. It allows cavalry to operate freely, and it allows supplies to be gathered, and perhaps most dangerously, it allows internal treachery to develop. Athens therefore faces a clear choice: wait and hope, or fight now and risk annihilation. The Athenians choose to fight, but they don't fight entirely alone. One small city answers the Athenian call. Plataea, long allied with Athens and threatened by Thebes, sends its entire hoplite force to stand beside the Athenians. Herodotus pauses to emphasize the significance of this decision. Plataea is not wealthy, it is not powerful, it cannot afford to alienate its neighbours lightly. By standing with Athens, though, Plataea commits itself completely. This will be remembered. In later years, Athens will repay this loyalty with protection and honour. Plataea will also pay for this in blood. At Plataea in 479 BC, the city will be destroyed. Here, however, its decision is simple and noble. When Athens faces destruction, Plataea does not calculate, it marches. Symbolically, this matters. Athens is not merely defending itself, it is defending an alliance, however small. The Athenian army is commanded in an unusual way. There are 10 generals, one from each city tribe, and a polemarch whose vote can break a tie. This reflects the experimental nature of Athenian democracy. Authority is debated and provisional, even where it is critically important. Among these commanders is Miltiades. Miltiades is not a typical Athenian politician. He has ruled in the Thracian Kerkonice under Persian authority. He knows Persian methods, he knows their strengths, and he knows their limits. It is Miltiades who argues most strongly that battle must be joined at once. Herodotus summarizes his reasoning. If they delay, the Persians gain advantages. Cavalry can operate, supplies can be gathered, Athenian morale may falter. Worst of all, the city itself may fracture. Miltiades understands something essential about citizen armies. They fight best when their cause is immediate and personal. Delay turns urgency into doubt. The generals argue. The vote is split. The polemarch casts his vote for Miltiades, and so the decision is made. Herodotus gives us an account of the battle that is restrained. There are no long speeches, there is no divine intervention. Instead, there is movement, there is collision, and there is outcome. The Athenians see the Persians disembarking from their ships. They advance at a run down the beach, a steep beach. This is unusual. Hoplites do not normally charge at speed. They do so here to minimize exposure to Persian arrows, sacrificing formation to survival. They also pick up speed because, as said, the beach at Marathon is rather steep, and once you start running down it in between 40 and 70 pounds weight of armour, it is rather difficult to stop. Herodotus tells us that the Greek centre is deliberately thinned while the wings are strengthened. This is not a mistake, it is a calculated risk. When the armies do collide, the Persian centre pushes the Greeks back. This is the moment of maximum danger. Had the Persian wings held, the Greeks might have been broken. But on the flanks, the heavily armoured hoplites crush their opponents. It's bronze against wicker, it's weight against mobility and discipline against flexibility. Then the decisive manoeuvre occurs. The Greek wings wheel inward and envelop the Persian centre. a bit like the tactics that Hannibal will later try at Cannae to terrible effect. This is not a massacre. Herodotus is careful here. The Persians fight, then they retreat, then they make a run for their ships. Many are cut down in the marshes near the shore. Herodotus gives numbers: thousands of Persians dead, fewer than 200 Athenians. The figures are almost certainly biased in opposite directions, but what matters is not the arithmetic, but the fact. A Persian army has been defeated in open battle by a citizen militia. This is not something that the Greeks had thought possible. Later tradition adds a story that has become inseparable from Marathon: the tale of Phidippides running from the battlefield to Athens, crying out "victory" and dying on the spot. Herodotus does not tell this story. He tells us instead of the run to Sparta, which is far more impressive physically and far more significant politically. The later version appears centuries afterwards and has inspired much poetry, including Browning's famous line, "Rejoice, we conquer." It is a beautiful legend. It has inspired a key part of the Olympic Games, but it is not history. Still, myths do not arise at random. They arise when meaning is needed. The story of the dying messenger compresses the entire experience of Marathon into a single image: exhaustion, sacrifice, and salvation. It turns a messy contingent battle into a moral parable. Herodotus, by contrast, leaves us with something more unsettling and more real. The Athenians have won a glorious victory. Yes, it is a glorious victory, but it's fragile and dangerous. The Persians have been beaten, they have not been destroyed, and Athens has just announced itself to the greatest empire in the world. Oh, it is a glorious victory. A smaller force has defeated a greater one. A free citizen army has defeated imperial troops. A single battle has appeared to decide the fate of Greece. Later generations will turn this into a foundational myth of the West, but that temptation should be resisted. Marathon did not end the Persian threat. It did not even seriously weaken the Persian Empire. Darius I did not abandon his plans because of Marathon. On the contrary, preparations for renewed intervention continued almost at once. Darius's death in 486 BC merely passed the task to his son Xerxes I, who returned with an army on a scale never before seen in Greece. For the Persians, Marathon was a local failure, not a strategic defeat. And yet, Marathon did change everything. Not because it altered the balance of power, but because it altered the Greek imagination. Before Marathon, Persian power was experienced as something distant but overwhelming. It was described in numbers too large to grasp, territories too vast to imagine, wealth beyond counting. Persia had crushed Lydia, Babylon, Egypt, and Ionia. It had absorbed entire civilizations. No Greek army had ever faced Persian troops in open battle and survived. After Marathon, that changed. For the first time, the Greeks could say, not in theory, but from experience, that Persian forces could be met and could be defeated, not through clever diplomacy, and certainly not through submission, but through arms. Herodotus never states this baldly, but it runs beneath his narrative. After Marathon, fear gives way to something far more dangerous to empires: confidence. The confidence is not universal. Most Greek states are still willing to submit when pushed. Many, of course, hedge their bets. Some will later side with Persia. Marathon does not produce unity, but it does produce possibility. Above all, Athens is transformed. The city emerges from Marathon with enormous prestige. Even the Spartans, when they finally turn up, give some grudging respect to what they achieved. Athens has stood alone, with only Plataea beside it, and it has survived. It has defended its territory without kings, without tyrants, and without Spartan help. That matters. For the first time, Athenian democracy appears not merely legitimate, but competent. The men who fought at Marathon are the same men who vote in the assembly and sit on juries. Military success and civic participation now reinforce one another. This has long-term consequences. In the years following Marathon, Athens begins to think differently about itself. It invests in naval power. It fortifies the city. It becomes more assertive in regional politics. It no longer sees itself as one city among many, but as a potential leader. Marathon also elevates individuals, briefly. Miltiades, whose insistence on immediate battle was decisive, becomes a hero. He's honoured and trusted. He's celebrated. But he is not a permanent saviour. His later career will end in disgrace and imprisonment. Success at Marathon does not confer lasting wisdom or moral authority. You see, Greek political culture does not sanctify generals. It uses them, then discards them. The idea that Marathon might establish a permanent ruling class of heroes is a later fantasy. More important than any individual is the idea that Marathon embeds. For the first time, Greek experience the thought that citizen soldiers can defend their freedom against empire. When Xerxes returns in 480 BC, the Greeks will not ask whether resistance is possible, they will ask whether it is worth the cost, and that is a considerable shift. Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, they're all unthinkable without Marathon, not because Marathon wins the war, but because it changes the terms of imagination. So the Persians have retreated, but they haven't been destroyed. The Athenians have won, but they are exhausted. The Spartans arrived too late to fight, but not too late to see the dead. Marathon creates a pause in the story, a pause filled with preparation and anxiety and some misunderstanding. The Persians will return believing that greater force will do the job. The Greeks will prepare believing that courage and terrain can overcome numbers. Both sides will be partly right and partly wrong. Later generations will look back on Marathon and see the beginning of Europe, the triumph of liberty, the salvation of civilization. Perhaps what we should see is something more human. A group of men fighting for their homes discover that the world is not as fixed as they had feared. Once that discovery is made, it cannot be undone. That belief, incomplete and easily overstated, will change history, and that's a term often used and often overused, but here I think it is used appropriately. So the war is not won, but it hasn't yet gone badly, and in our next lecture we shall see how it proceeds.